The Last of Us 2 is a game that was impossible to objectively analyze when it launched. Last June, after trying my best to avoid the leaks, I remember nervously booting up the game on launch day. A mixture of anxiousness and excitement combined to create a feeling of uncertainty about the overall experience I was about to be a part of. When I played the game for the first time, I remember feeling heavily invested in certain characters, but conflicted on the overall narrative the story was telling, and its repetitive and, at times, monotonous pacing. The production quality was no doubt top-notch, but this sequel was more complicated to love or hate. I left plenty of feelings and emotions on the table back then, trying to understand and rationalize if Naughty Dog truly pulled off another masterpiece, or if the internet mob was right and this game was an overrated piece of garbage. A few weeks ago, Sony released a PS5 patch for the game, and I decided now was the perfect time to replay the game and sort out my feelings. To get my thoughts on the original game out of the way, I think from a narrative, character, and immersion standpoint, The Last of Us is an absolute masterpiece. The soul-stirring journey of Joel and Ellie as they venture towards the Fireflies in Salt Lake City is so tangible and human. In the same way Nolan made The Dark Knight feel bigger than a superhero movie, Naughty Dog gave The Last of Us qualities that were so foreign to video games at the time, and made it feel as though the game transcended the medium it took place in. Voice actors gave Academy Award level vocal and motion capture performances with facial animations that seemed impossibly accurate at the time. The world was constructed so densely with unrivaled attention to detail and nuance that seamlessly matched in both cutscenes and gameplay. Every detail Naughty Dog created came together to push the medium to what felt like the highest cinematic storytelling potential it could achieve. What would be okay gameplay in another game never became tiresome because strong characters, perfect pacing, and a powerful narrative elevated every aspect of the player-controlled elements. The Last of Us, then, is a fantastically well-made video game with an incredible story. There's no denying that. It's a story that would probably be great no matter what medium it were in, like if it were a movie or a TV show. However, because The Last of Us wasn't one of those, and it was a video game, I believe there are opportunities that Naughty Dog took advantage of that allowed for greater narrative potency than if it weren't a video game in the first place. Even in the most personal movies or TV shows, the characters still feel at an arm's length from the audience. We can identify with their struggles as we watch them on screen and empathize with them. But in a video game, players synchronize their being with the being of the main character in a more personal and subjective way when compared to films. We kill in their name, fight through their struggles, and observe their most subtle tendencies, features, and innate characteristics. Don't get me wrong, movies and television can also create strong bonds between the viewer and the characters, and I'm not saying that video games are better at characterization. But I believe because games match our emotions with the main protagonist more so than in films, their narratives can be told with a more effective subjective prejudice. This means the motivations and the quests of the main character can be rationalized easier because we aren't just experiencing each moment from the outside looking in, but instead, we the player are driving that story forward. We decide how much time we take, how many enemies we kill, and how each moment is reached and when it is reached. Now, not all video games accomplish this the same way. Games can have either a passive or active storytelling method. Passive storytelling is where game developers and designers create immersive worlds and powerful gameplay elements to create the feeling of a cohesive story with less of a focus on a narrative and more focus on the player control. Breath of the Wild comes to mind as a prime example of this method of storytelling. Almost each interaction is optional, and truly the only narrative sequence required is the first mission you receive, to beat Ganon. The incentive to keep playing isn't to find out which cutscene or narrative milestone the developers will reveal to you. Instead, the motivation stems from the fun gameplay mechanics and the ability to explore and discover. The choice to move forward then is entirely yours, and the protagonist is almost always a vessel for the main character. Active storytelling, on the other hand, is more similar to filmmaking. Characters and stories are built through dialogue, and the path of the narrative is often extremely linear, with pre-scripted events frequently pushing you to keep on playing. Characters, while playable, can do things that truly clash with the morals and feelings of the player. In gameplay, there are moments where players can decide how to take on a particular encounter, but overall, the experience from player to player is nearly identical. The motivation to push forward in these actively told video game stories comes from the appeal of the narrative and how effectively it's told, rather than the gameplay systems carrying the experience. Both Last of Us games nicely fit into this category of active storytelling. These are games carried by their ability to tell powerful stories through pre-scripted cinema-style events, despite having rigidly moral characters and narratives. I would argue that the subjective viewpoints of the main character in both actively and passively told video game stories distorts our viewpoint in favor of the main character, more so than if those stories and characters were on screen in a film or TV show. In horror movies, we may watch characters run away and protect themselves, but in The Last of Us, we do it ourselves. Will Ellie die here, or will I save her? We are Joel in the first game, and we are Ellie in the second game. Pushing the characters forward through the story requires active participation from the player instead of passive viewership. While Joel wasn't a vessel per se for my emotions like in so many other games, he was the first-person perspective I took control of. I empathize with Joel not because I decided which actions he would take, but rather because I am motivating his choices. We literally walk in his shoes, so we understand the events that determine his decisions, even if they are pre-planned by developers and game directors. This bond makes the characters feel independent from a particular story and narrative by further attaching us to the singular perspectives we took control of. In this way, the player-character connection video games utilize is an extremely potent tool that films cannot similarly replicate. And while the first Last of Us demonstrated how blinding this connection can be by the game's finale, it's The Last of Us 2 that actively tries to weaponize that player-character bond against the emotions of the player.
'Cause I'm wrong.
At its core, The Last of Us 2 is a fairly simple revenge plot. After Ellie sees her father figure Joel get brutally murdered by Abby, a militia group leader, Ellie and a few friends from Jackson take up arms to find and kill the group responsible for Joel's death. On their way, trials, pain, and pregnancies alter Ellie's blood-stricken nosedive towards a complete and total mental breakdown. Each kill leads Ellie closer and closer to finding Abby, but further and further away from a path of redemption. Especially after playing the first game, it can be truly depressing to see how far Ellie has gone from the girl she was. After many murders and lost friends, Ellie finally finds and confronts Abby. Right as tensions are at their peak, the game fades to black and the story starts from the beginning all over again.
We let you both live, and you wasted it!
Day 1 appears on the black screen just like at the start of the game. The only difference is this time, the player takes control of Abby, the game's villain. For this run through the story, we see how Joel and Ellie's previous choices impacted Abby's life, family, and friends in catastrophic ways. The game tries to draw these parallels between Ellie and Abby to make the player question who is right and who we should actually be rooting for. You see, until the very end of the first Last of Us, Joel and Ellie made questionable choices at times, but the game had always justified their rationale by using their subjective viewpoint to validate their actions. In that game, we see friends betraying friends, humans killing each other more than the infected, and the greatest gestures of kindness from others disguised as contorted measures of evil and deception. Every instance of love or friendship eventually corrodes and dies with a world that continually kills all that is good. Joel and Ellie's relationship was the one perfect and pure thing left to us in that game. So when Joel decided to choose Ellie over humanity, my personal connection to Joel's emotions could somehow rationalize his impossible choice. But in The Last of Us 2, the player-character connection that we had with Joel is used as a weapon against us. Each moment of understanding and revenge is countered with loss and destruction. One act of bravery and vengeance for a lost loved one is now a violent murder of a friend and an equally sympathetic human being. Ellie no longer appears as the sweet and smart girl we met in the first game, but instead she's a war-hardened killer who, like her father, will do whatever it takes to protect the people she cares about. Many have aired criticism for the game's treatment of Ellie and the way Naughty Dog forces us to empathize with the villain of Ellie's story. Many might argue that their hatred of this game comes from a hatred of Abby's character, or a disrespect for Joel and Ellie. And while I can definitely share in many of those sentiments, I also think these feelings stem from something else. In the previous section, we talked about how and why a video game creates a unique player-character connection when compared to other storytelling mediums like film or TV shows. When I took control of Ellie in the first half of The Last of Us 2, I was totally invested. I would search through every cabinet, drawer, and crevice to find every detail, piece of dialogue, and moment that could further my understanding of Ellie. Those tiny little notes, I would read every single one of them, and I cherished each journal entry Ellie wrote and deliberated on every lyric she came up with as a window into her mind and mental state at the time. Every guitar I passed, I'd pick up and watch Ellie subtly smile as she played, giving a flicker of light to this bleak, bleak game. When I played as Ellie, I only used the sprint button during combat because, at other times, I would just walk slowly, trying to deal with the emotions of the story and appreciate the moments I witnessed as the character. For the first half of The Last of Us 2, the player-character bond was in full effect, and each kernel of information was a cherished prize for me to move forward in gameplay. But flash forward halfway through the game when we take control of Abby, and my mentality and connection completely changed. Now I was sprinting through sections, barely listening to dialogue, and finding it difficult to connect to any new characters I'd been introduced to. Each moment of humanization I would dismiss as a contrived narrative device Naughty Dog was using to manipulate the player and the story. The pacing, the human dialogue, and the motivation for playing was entirely lost on me. The climactic end to the entire first half of the game, finding out what was going to happen to Ellie, was now locked behind a daunting 12-hour secondary campaign controlling the villain of Ellie's story. Each combat section with Abby and every puzzle I encountered was about as compelling as doing household chores. After marathoning for hours when I was playing as Ellie, I remember skipping days and having to force myself to pick up the controller for this second half. The narrative thrust, connection to the characters, and the story I wanted to play was gone. I hated Abby, and I loved Ellie. Why couldn't I just finish the story I wanted to play? Naughty Dog not only removed the player's foundation and motivation to play, but they also actively use our feelings and connection to Ellie and Joel as a way to resist empathizing with Abby. Don't get me wrong, I understood what Naughty Dog was trying to do, but even after witnessing the company's incredible storytelling in the past, I didn't want to give them a chance this time. I didn't want them to humanize Abby, no matter how similar she was to Joel or Ellie. But after finishing The Last of Us 2, what of this choice? Does it actually pay off? Is spending half of this entire game forcing the player to control the villain fruitless? Or has Naughty Dog done something wholly original and evocative with this dual narrative? After playing the game twice now, and having nearly a year to think about the meaning and efficacy of this sequel's story, I think my answers to these questions are quite complicated. You see, on one hand, the way Naughty Dog tests our ability to forgive and understand through this dual narrative is pretty brilliant. Unlike a movie, it forces the player to grapple with their own vengeful and hateful feelings towards a character as the game progresses by literally walking in both characters' shoes. Conceptually, I applaud Naughty Dog for challenging the medium's potent connection between the player and the character they inhabit. But on the other hand, I really didn't enjoy or even like playing as Abby. The pacing of the story and enjoyability of the gameplay were harmed by having half the game from Abby's perspective and half from Ellie's. If I'd only watched Abby's story like in a film, I know much of the internal struggle that took place inside of me while playing would have been gone, hurting the intention of what Naughty Dog wanted to convey. But with that being said, I also believe my haste to return to Ellie and resistance towards Abby's characterization would have been far more digestible and interesting if I didn't have to motivate the game's antagonist. The subjective connection I had with Ellie's plight had deteriorated by the time I reached the game's finale, and my connection to Abby failed to reach the standard the series had set for itself in the past. Once again, as a story, I conceptually understand the meaning and even acknowledge the emotional impact of walking in Abby's shoes. But as a video game story, I think the pacing, player-character connection, and the gameplay all suffer from this choice. Unlike the first game, and unlike video games as a whole, The Last of Us 2 asks us to take an objective view on the story itself, while asking us to connect to the characters in the same subjective manner we did in the first half of the game and in the previous title. Instead of inhabiting the emotions of a particular character or story, the player is alienated farther from the main characters and can feel inconsequential to the story, or as if they were watching the events unfold in a film. Yet, in films, we don't have to hold forward and we don't have to walk in the shoes of other playable characters. The Last of Us 1 synced the subjective viewpoint of Joel with the player. Our motivations to move forward in that story always made sense because we were convinced we were inhabiting the main character. The Last of Us 2 does the opposite. It asks the player to motivate a story forward that conflicts with our previous connections to the narrative and the characters. It not only corrodes the potency of the bond we had with Ellie and Joel, but it asks us to objectively reconcile the game's meaning, despite being a story and series that has been purely subjectively viewed up until this point. And that's what makes The Last of Us 2's choice so difficult. On one hand, I'm almost certain this is exactly what Naughty Dog was trying to do. They were trying to expose just how blindingly we connect to the characters we control in games. The story wouldn't have had the same impact on me if it weren't a video game. But actually playing the game and moving the story forward, it wasn't really enjoyable. I'm not even sure it was worth the 12-hour detour to arrive at the game's narrative meaning. But I will acknowledge that it did challenge me to think about why I didn't want to care about Abby, or why I wanted to put down my controller in disgust when I had to fight for characters that I had just killed hours before. If Abby's portion of the story were a movie instead of an interactive video game, I probably wouldn't have been as emotionally conflicted with myself and the material Naughty Dog put in front of me. But if Abby's section were a movie, I also wouldn't have dreaded watching it like I dreaded playing it. In the end, it all comes back to that player-character connection we talk so much about. Naughty Dog decided to weaponize the greatest tool the original Last of Us used to ground us in its story. The result is a narrative that asks players to forgive and empathize with our enemies by literally walking in their shoes. As a sequel, it may be poorly paced, less personal, and mechanically stale by the end of its 24-hour-long story. But at the same time, it's an evocative demonstration of the potency and uniqueness video game stories offer perspectives, while also being a bold sequel from a studio that is constantly pushing the narrative boundaries of what the medium can do. If you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate if you give it a like and a subscribe, and check out my most recent video essay on why I think anime is actually kind of cool. I've been trying to devote more time to making videos like these, so if you'd like to support me, I would greatly appreciate any shares, likes, favorites, or whatever. Honestly, I'm just glad you made it this far, and I'd love to talk in the comments if you have any thoughts. Until the next time, I'll see you guys.